I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. If you think politics is polarizing and contested, try government procurement sometime. The government, from the city and county to state and federal, is one of the biggest buyers of goods and services in any modern economy. Sometimes it can be the largest single buyer of, for example, road repair and grass cutting services. And these government contracts tend to be contested and yet are often accused of corruption. Last month, in June, the usually mundane meeting of the Bureau of Public Works, Maryland's apex contract awarding body, came alive when the Department of Public Safety sought to remove an incumbent vendor, YesCare, from a contract to provide free trial healthcare services in the state. YesCare protested. The audio comes from the official Bureau of Public Works record, so please bear with us.
My name is Phil Andrews. I'm outside counsel in Maryland for YesCare. Centurion has less than minimal jails experience. The Wyoming proposal that Centurion submitted said our focus, our intentional work is on big state systems. We don't want to be distracted by jails. And they've done 3 jails, as far as we can tell, one no longer they're doing in Florida. The Baltimore City facility, mental health only, which is a much lesser burden, if you will, than medical. And the other is in a place that has, in Minnesota, an average daily population of 600, just nothing like what's faced in the Baltimore pretrial facilities. And so we heard some other things a few minutes ago. Better MBE goals, and that's terrific. And YesCare, and Ms. Ray is a living testament to that. YesCare strongly believes in MBE, but I've looked at the revised agenda item, and it already shows that Centurion's chipping away at MBE. They've already asked for a waiver for MBE, and they've pretty much gutted the Asian American sub-goal. So, again, all the same goals. You didn't see anything in the substantial state interest that said YesCare wasn't doing what it should be doing with respect to MBEs. And these sorts of conclusory kinds of things saying, well, everything will be better, staffing will be better. The question there is, in terms of pricing, YesCare's pricing was 28% above what the minimum of the RFP. YesCare also has a labor peace agreement, which Centurion doesn't have. Centurion's been in the state for 6 years, never sought to have a labor peace agreement. YesCare has no experience in helping governmental entities get out from under consent decrees or federal settlement agreements. And Duval, which was mentioned a moment ago, is the perfect example of that.
The new vendor, Centurion, made the case for how they offered the state a better deal, meeting both cost and public policy goals, such as subcontracting to minority and women-owned businesses, often called by its abbreviation MBE. And the normally calm state treasurer, Derek Davis, finally took some umbrage.
We heard about MBE goals and the like, labor peace and so forth. We heard about all the business aspects, and I get it. We are talking a contract. But unless I missed it, and that very well could have happened, we didn't really hear much about healthcare. For the individuals that are being served, that was not front and center. I didn't hear anybody, talk about the quality of care that they're providing and how they intend to do better or what changes were going to be made, what programmatic changes. That's really what this is supposed to be about. If you're trying to sell me on something, let's show a little compassion, a little conversation, not about who's making money. It seems that the care for the inmates is secondary. I'm not worried about which rich company gets this contract over that rich company. Totally irrelevant to me. We're talking about the quality of care for the people that we have served. No matter the circumstances that landed them there, we're still responsible for it. And that's where the attention needs to be made. it's not.
Sitting near Treasurer Davis was Comptroller Brooke Learman, whose office had just then put out the Maryland Procurement Playbook, a 45-page document gathering research on the state's procurement system from NOAC Metrofinance Lab at Drexel University, which is headed by urban politics scholar Bruce Katz, formerly of the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. All of this got me thinking about the black box of government procurement, and I set out to find someone who knew more. My search landed Erin Sher Smith, the former chief procurement officer of the city of Baltimore, who now works for the consulting firm Zectech and Company, helping clients navigate the choppy waters of government procurement. But who knows for how long? Stay with us.
I Hate Politics is brought to you by UMBC's Political Science Program, where you'll learn to shape public policy, impact communities, and function at the center of modern society. Learn more at shadygrove.umbc.edu.
I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society moving, precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from Alexandria, Virginia, art rock band Jackie and the Treehorns. Stephen Rubin and Pam Long on vocals, guitars, and piano. Frank Caputo on the bass and synth. And Brian Gibson on the drums.
The secrets we keep, exposing what's underneath. Do you have something to hide?
Last Tuesday's news bulletin, we made two mistakes. I said that the Maryland State Legislature had approved an increase to the salaries of the Montgomery County Board of Education. And I said that the president of the board was paid $35,000. Correction. The state legislature considered the increase but did not pass it. And the board president makes $29,000. We love to hear from you when you like what we do on the show and when you think we have been remiss. It's easy to send us a voice letter, record on your phone, and email the file to producer@ihppod.org. If you send us video, we can extract the audio, no problem.
If they only knew, if they only knew, what would the world come to?
Erin Sher Smith, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Thank you for having me.
You have been one of the stalwarts of the procurement system in Maryland and have been the chief of procurement at the city of Baltimore. How is government procurement different from private buying?
In private procurement, you make your own rules. You can change your rules. You don't have to have any rules. It's really just getting, the best deal that you feel you want to get. Public procurement is the exact opposite. Very strict rules, often set by state law, federal law, local law. There's regulations. You have to follow a process. There's many more people involved. There's a lot of oversight and transparency. In addition to trying to get, the best value, the best price, and the best services, you're also using the government spending power to support your policies, local hiring policies, minority and women-owned business policies, veteran-owned business policies, all of youth hiring programs. All of those are supported by procurement activities.
Why do we have the proverbial $300 toilet seat?
I was in a meeting with an executive who was asked to approve a very large, expensive printer for specialized printing needs, and did a quick Google search and found it cheaper online. And I said, well, the reason we can't do that is, one, we're required to put the bid out. And if somebody does have an online business, but they don't submit a bid, then we can't award to them because they did not offer this printer to us. We're required to have public advertisement. We're required to have competition that the public can see and respond to. And so reaching out personally to get a price does not achieve that goal. In addition, we are expected to train all of our employees on how to use this printer. So we have training requirements. We have requested them to install it. So someone has to actually be here, install it, do the setup, work with our IT to make sure it's functioning properly. I'm sure everybody knows what it feels like to buy a printer and have it, get home. Maybe you had Amazon ship it and you plug it in and it just doesn't work and you can't figure out how, and you don't know how to use it to the full extent. That's what we don't want. The government wants it to be delivered, installed, trained, and actually working. So all of those things cost more.
You said that a government contract must be bid out. The intention may be to secure competitive benefits, but you're ending up paying more. And I have also heard you say that procurement costs money.
You've hit on something that's like the fundamental balancing act that procurement always has to do. The more you ask procurement to do, the more it costs. And then the more people may feel that we're not getting the best deal. And some of that is because it is a lengthy process. It's a complicated process. And you don't want to make it so complicated that people don't want to submit a bid. You want a company to understand what you're asking, have it be clearly written, not too onerous on the paperwork. You submit a bid and you feel like you're going to have a fair shot at winning. There's a lot of things that will turn off businesses from bidding to the government, and that somehow will reduce competition. So, and I know this is something that the state is really looking at, is improving the experience for vendors, improving the the ability to find opportunities, the ease of responding, because when it's more complicated, then we get less responses. When you get less responses, your prices go up. So there's two things driving prices up: is less competition because of the process, and also additional requirements that wouldn't normally be in a contract, but are required by whichever, whether it's state or local governments, procurement regulations.
So no matter how much you try to finesse this is always a trade-off. For example, with buying computer cybersecurity, that's a hugely complicated transaction, and perhaps not, a series of transactions, not just one. How do you trade that off? Is this even balanceable in any reasonable way?
It's not balanceable in the way that there's no right answer. It's always moving. And it's just going to constantly move back and forth between simplicity and achieving more goals. And I think a really good example, and this is often mentioned whenever people are looking at reforming procurement, is, do we need more blanket contracts? Do we need more master contracts? Or do we need less master contracts, blanket contracts?
Please explain master contracts and blanket contracts.
When you know that you have constant need for something, but you don't know exactly what it is and when you're going to need it, the most effective way to handle this is to have usually multi-vendor blanket contracts, often called master contracts, which then you will either have smaller contracts for projects, or you'll just order off of that contract And you can do it by rotating among the vendors on the contract. You can do it by doing smaller bids in like a second bidding phase. Almost every larger jurisdiction has these. But I have seen them mentioned as locking out smaller minority-owned companies. And I did think this was really good. I saw this in the state's recent procurement release, was having a more frequent window for opening and adding new vendors. I think that is a way to handle it. But as you can see, it's a constant feel that maybe we've become too efficient. Master contracts might be, saving the government time and money, but possibly locking out certain companies from participating.
The Maryland Comptroller's Office released a big report on the state of procurement in the state of Maryland. What are they trying to achieve with this report?
What I thought the most important part of the report is that it acknowledges just how many different entities in the state are procuring and how they all have a different process. And so, one of the points is to reduce all of these differences, to remove the barriers to entry for the smaller firms.
The narrative that actually dogs procurement is corruption. Can you make the distinction between inefficiency and corruption?
Whenever mistakes are made in procurement, or whenever the results aren't what somebody wanted, very, very often, the very first thing you hear is somebody knows somebody, or somebody got something from this. And I would say it's almost never the case. There are attempts to lean on people, and I have been subjected to some pressure that I thought was improper. But that's why you have procurement professionals running procurements, because they understand the ethics behind it. They've been trained on these issues. When you have decentralized procurement with agencies working on it, they don't really understand conflicts of interest. They don't really understand some of these issues that would tend for the public to believe was corruption. When there's a conflict of interest, does an agency really understand how to identify those and how to address them, how to do the research? No. But does that mean that it was intentionally allowed? No. So that's why I feel that it is important to have a professional procurement staff working on your procurement, rather than just, boots on the ground, people in the field handling the procurement side. I have only seen one or two things in my time that I feel warranted investigation on the government side. I have seen issues with vendors that have been referred to investigation. I have worked on debarring vendors who have used the process to the government's detriment.
Over what period of time?
Over about 15 years. And one of them did, result in termination of that employee.
One of the first things you mentioned was that governments, quite apart from procuring a widget, have an interest in furthering public policy of some sort. Very typically, this is giving contracts to minority-owned businesses or women-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses. When that happens, can you also at the same time get the most cost-effective deal?
There's three different ways, really, you could increase minority business participation. The one that we see most often is the subcontracting requirements. And that is where there are goals set on contracts. And whenever you have a company that is required to utilize a smaller pool for subcontracting, I think that is going to increase price slightly, just because there's you're not competing amongst the entire vendor population, but a smaller population. The smaller your pool that you're getting your bids from, the more likely you'll pay a little bit more. Additionally, both the subcontractors and the prime contractors have to charge a little bit more for their services because there's a lot of administrative costs with tracking participation.
What are the two other ways in which we promote minority, women, and veteran-owned businesses?
So the other ways that are often used would be a preference. So that would be everybody competes against each other, but certain companies reserve a certain percentage preference. So, for instance, that would be if there's a local business preference, and a local government could say anyone who is from our county or the three surrounding counties will have can bid up to 10% higher than the competitors and still be considered the low bid. And then the third way would be a set aside. And that is where the minority women and like veteran-owned businesses or the small businesses are only competing against each other. And those are generally designated in advance as being set aside for just competition amongst those companies.
One of the things I've always wondered, particularly about local preference, as you described, is whether it violates the Interstate Commerce Clause.
Many places have been able to do it. The only problem is that, let's say Baltimore City does it, and then Prince George's County does it, so that, whether it's in retaliation, if you're not going to give a benefit to our businesses, we're not going to give a benefit to your business, then everybody just has local preference against each other. And then jurisdiction has to decide, does this hurt my businesses more than it helps my business? And I think that's often why they decide not to do it, because they understand that, a lot of our businesses work elsewhere.
So it's basically an arms race and you want to avoid one.
Exactly.
The subcontracting requirements, the preference requirements, and the set-asides, generally in Maryland and Maryland jurisdictions, what are they?
For Baltimore, the program is primarily driven by subcontracting goals. There are also some preferences. However, the city has not utilized its ability to have set-asides.
Why not?
There was a very big concern among the minority vendor community that if there was a set-aside for small businesses that was race neutral, then that would harm the minority and women-owned business program, because that would be a competing program. So smaller contracts would be split off of large contracts, moved to a set-aside program, and then the subcontracting opportunities would no longer be there.
Okay, so there's some tension between the subcontracting method and the set-aside method.
Correct. And I think there's room for both. However, the people that were charged with starting up this program did not feel that was the case. And so it did not move ahead.
Where in Baltimore's procurement, for example, would a set-aside program be the most effective way to do exactly what you're asking for?
So a set-aside program has to work where there are players in the industry, but where they're not able to get in sufficiently as subcontractors. So it would really require some digging. But, like the state's report mentioned, so much spend is with IT. I would like someone to really dig into whether IT services would be a great place for set aside. I did try to set up a pilot program for very small IT contracts where it's just for small local minority businesses. And I was working with the city's IT department to set something up. I don't believe they ever went ahead with that, but I think that's really where there's some space to see if it would work.
If you can't unbundle, then you can't set aside. So how do you unbundle?
the way the city started unbundling, first, what we did is we took the list of all the contracts we have, and we looked at them with the agency to say, is this something that can be unbundled? Makes sense to unbundle it. If we only have one vendor, can we have 3? Can we have 5? Are there certain aspects of the scope that can be pulled out and bid separately? So all of those things are you're looking at with an eye towards being inclusionary, but also being efficient. You don't want to lose all your efficiency, because then the answer would be unbundle everything. And that obviously can't happen. And in fact, I think we ended up increasing by 50% the number of contracts we were expected to bid in a year. And obviously, then you would need to increase your staff by 50%. And one of the administrations with the city informed us that no contract should be longer than 3 years, no matter what. And and obviously, for some of the services, or especially some of the IT contracts where you're getting 5-year licenses or 10-year licenses, you do not want to bid a financial system every 3 years. You do not want to bid your water meter system every 3 years. So I felt that was very misguided. However, we made efforts to do so, and the workload just increased so much.
Isn't that what the state's report is saying, to open many more windows?
It is, but it can't be done with a blanket statement of nothing longer than 3 years. It has to be done in a targeted way. And so that's what we would do, is we would go through the contracts and see which ones should be unbundled. And there are plenty that just were too big. We would still get great service. We'd still get good prices. We would maybe even have like a better coverage if we unbundled it. So those are the ones that we would identify. And then the next step, which I think is really where people get lost, is, all right, so now you have many more vendors under contract for similar services. How do you then assign the work? Is there a secondary bidding process? Is there a rotation? If there's a bidding process and you went from 3 vendors to 9 vendors, do you bid amongst all 9 vendors each time? What if a vendor never wins, even being on contract? They never get the opportunity to actually provide services. So that's something you want to make sure that you've set up a method of assignment of work that also is inclusive.
What advice do you have for vendors based on all of this?
One of the things that I really like when vendors do is a lot of the procurement process allows for questions and answers. And some vendors might feel that somebody else is favored for the job, and they see something in the procurement that makes them feel that way, and they don't point it out. They don't call attention to it. They don't ask if that was necessarily written that way. Sometimes it can just be a mistake. And this is actually something that really reduces competition inadvertently, and vendors have the ability to correct this. If there is a requirement for, I'm going to give an example. Let's say we put out a bus contract where we want charter buses, and we want prices on 27 passenger buses and 30 passenger buses, or 12 passenger buses. And let's say that is not industry standard. But the research our procurement officer did says, okay, these are some reasonable bus sizes. And it turns out that those are very restricted to a particular bus manufacturer who is they're only used by one charter company. And so it seems fair. It was intended to be fair. And yet everybody says, well, I'm not going to bid on that because I have a 28-person bus and I have a 13-person bus.
When an agency is doing that, saying, I want a 27 capacity bus or a 12 capacity bus that is not industry standard, that seems that the requirements are written to the vendor.
That is where the procurement officer has to say, hey, I found out that this is not industry standard. We're not going to get competition this way. You can't bid it unless you can prove it is an actual requirement. Is it because you're transporting prisoners and there's requirements for numbers of prisoners versus is there a legal reason that you have to have buses that are different than the norm? Or is this because you just went online and researched some buses and you didn't realize it was only one company you looked at? So this is something that procurement should do to make sure the agencies aren't only specifying what they're currently using versus what meets their needs.
Okay. Is there a difference between procurement for capital purchases and procurement for operating purchases? We want to move some things from operating budget to capital budget, for example, with HVAC, right? Because when you move to capital budget, the state will share the cost. But when you have an operating cost alone, then the county has to pay for it.
We're going away from the large purchase of equipment and software, and we're going to cloud services or even think like, for instance, body cameras and tasers. They're not purchased anymore. They're there's a subscription or at the monthly payment, and so that makes it difficult because some of these really large capital costs are now going to operating costs, and the question is how to get them back to that.
What do you do?
So sometimes it's just a question of looking at, why does it matter? Does it matter because it removes a source of funds that otherwise would be there? And if that's the case, look at changing whether the source of funds can be redefined to include these new these purchases that are now subscription services versus a capital purchase. One example was, the Next Gen 911. The state would pay for certain things that did not include, maintenance, ongoing costs. It would include purchase of new equipment. But if that's the way the world is changing, what about redefining what the state's going to cover? And that's what happened.
But you don't have control over the state. You are Baltimore.
No. I don't have control of the state. But when everyone got together and discussed it, this was one of the biggest concerns with how 911 was funded.
Does the procurement report that the state produced, the comptroller produced, address this issue?
I don't believe so. I don't recall seeing that issue in there.
That's amazing, though. It puts a huge burden on the operating budget at a time when you can't really increase taxes easily.
The city of Baltimore had similar issues with their fleet program. You purchase vehicles, and then to save money, we put off maintenance. We have old vehicles that need a lot of maintenance. They're more downtime, so the vehicles that are running are getting used more often. People are maybe working overtime to try to repair these. So the costs were just, astronomical to maintain an old, out-of-date fleet. And so Department of General Services and the Budget Bureau worked to create a new process. They call it the master lease, where the vehicles were always going to be either up to 5 years old or up to 10 years old based on what type of vehicle it is. If it's a patrol car or if it's a dump truck, they would go into these different tranches of the 5 or 10 year. And then the agency pays monthly on the debt service to purchase these. So instead of having to budget for a new vehicle, they pay a set monthly amount so that they always have a reasonably new, in working condition vehicle. And And I think that was an absolutely great program, very successful.
And I have never leased a vehicle. I have always bought my vehicles outright. Even, I take a loan for them. Going back to my original question, that's a big difference between private procurement and public procurement. There seems to be a preference in public procurement for these master leases, but it still makes sense to me as an individual to go buy the car that I need.
However, if your budget doesn't allow you to buy a new car this year, and the old model was purchasing outright, if you needed a new patrol car, you would, need $37,000 in your budget for that car this year. Whereas if you can spread it out over a 5-year period, you can actually get that new car.
Erin Shearsmith, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for having me on.
That's Erin Shearsmith, former Chief Procurement Officer for the City of Baltimore and now a procurement consultant for the firm ZecTech. The big lesson I take away from this conversation is that corruption and waste trade off with each other. If you want to reduce corruption in government procurement, and by and large most governments are on board with that, you need more supervision, more monitoring, more procedures, more rules, more laws, all of which means more staff and more time and more money. Which, if you now turn the coin over, looks like waste. Why do you get a $300 toilet seat? Because removing the possibility and even the impression of corruption requires multiple levels of bureaucracy. And every level of bureaucracy costs money. If you want to cut waste, you might have to accept a minimal level of corruption. So you can fight corruption or fight waste. You can't fight both at the same time. That's all for this episode of I Hate Politics, where we aim to stem the decline in local news by working with community voices. Don't forget to tune in to our Tuesday morning news analyses. I Hate Politics is produced by me, Sunil Dasgupta, and assistant producer, Adama Gay, with support from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I direct UMBC's political science program at the universities at Shady Grove in Montgomery County, where, among other things, we explore and learn about politics, government, and society close to home. Music for this episode comes from Alexandria, Virginia alt-rock band Jackie and the Treehorns, Steve Rubin and Pam Long on vocals, guitars, and piano, Frank Caputo on bass and synth, and Brian Gibson on drums. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihbpod.org. I hope you will subscribe, share, and rate the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.